Welcome to Watercolor. Today we're going to be talking about fundamental watercolor techniques. We're going to be talking about a few different uses of just straight watercolor, some water, and paper. So how to make different marks, make different blends, different gradients. So today you will be focusing on 8 different techniques. We'll be going through each one, how to produce it, and you'll be able to work back through this video and recreate it on your piece of 6x6 watercolor paper. That being said, to get started, you are going to get a piece of 6" by 6" watercolor paper. Our goal for this paper is to divide it up into a tic-tac-toe board, basically, 3 rows, 3 columns. You can do this very particularly with one of the rulers from the back. Make sure you're using the inch side and lining up the edge of your paper with the 0. So here I'll line my paper up with the 0. You can see it's approximately 6 inches. I'm going to mark at 2 and 4, so skipping every 2 inches. If I'm measuring, I'm always measuring from the same sides. Since I measured from the left down here, I'm going to measure from the left up here as well. Putting the 0 on the edge, marking 2 and 4. You do not have to be this precise. You can be a lot more open-ended with this and freehand it as long as the spaces are about the same size. So I'll do that for the other ones. Kind of marking it. It's about a third. It's about a third. It gives me a space to work from. What we're going to do is in the upper left-hand corner, I want some very important information. I want your name. Let's make sure we include last names on this. We do have a couple people with the same first name in this class. And you can title it something. For me, I'm going to call it Fundamental Watercolors, or Fundamental Watercolor Techniques. Now you will notice that I'm using a pencil. I'm going to encourage you to use a pencil for this. Some of the markers that we have, especially pens, they'll tend to bleed with the watercolor, so we want to try to keep it as consistent as possible. So we're going to set this up. The next thing you're going to want to do is label this. At this point you can pause the video to go through the different stages. We'll talk about them individually, but I don't see the point in spending some of your time labeling them. So I've set up a pre-drawn piece of paper. So if you want to see what we're using and some of our techniques, you can look at that. We're going to do wet on dry on wet, dry on dry, dry on wet, a solid wash, so making it consistent, a gradated wash, a variegated wash. We're going to talk about how to use glazing techniques to build colors up. So once you get this set up, you can unpause the video and go forward. So what we need to talk about is what materials you need. The basics, you're going to get your watercolor paper. Another thing you will need is a set of watercolors. So for this we'll be using the Prang oval ones. You will notice this has all the primary and secondary colors plus black and brown. If you want white, we need to leave our paper white. So we're not going to be actually adding white, we're going to be working around areas that we want to leave white. These sets come in different stages of use. Some of them may be a little bit more used, some of them may be closer to new. They will all work the same. The big thing I want to point out, and I'm going to move my paper for this, is we're going to start just by misting them with a spray bottle. So there should be spray bottles in the back of the room on the supply counter with these. I'm just going to ask that you mist over them just to add water to them. That way we can do some of the dry brushing techniques. So we've added water to these. The next thing you will want is a piece of scrap paper. I have various sizes of watercolor scrap paper cut in the back, so you can grab one of these. It's always helpful to see how much paint or how much water you have on your brush before going to a final project. So most watercolor artists tend to use a piece of scrap on the side. One thing I want to point out right now is I'm just trying to show that watercolor is a transparent medium. We're not trying to cover things up, we're trying to add cover over it, but drawings and things underneath it will show through. It's not opaque or unable to be seen through like acrylic paint or tempera, so please don't think of it that way. If we do, we'll build it up. We'll get this really shiny layer. Watercolor is really meant to breathe, to let the paper breathe, and you should be able to see most of your marks pretty clearly. So we'll talk about building layers, but you don't want it to be thick and cakey. If it's shiny, you're probably using too much paint, not enough water. So piece of scrap paper. The next thing you'll need will be a paper towel. We'll use this for techniques in a later lesson, but it'll also help you rinse and wash your brush, all of which can be done at your table with the addition of a cup of water. I'm going to tilt this. I keep it about half full just for transparent or transportation use. Transparency also helps with the paint. The big thing to pay attention to with this is how dirty your water is getting. If I was painting, say, a yellow, but my water was pretty purple, it's going to mix together. Those complementary colors are going to make a brown. So you can empty this and refill it as often as need be. So make sure you have a cup of water. And then the last thing that you're really going to need is brushes. I do have a container in the back, and all the yellow handled brushes are typically watercolor brushes. These are the ones that come with the set. You're welcome to use these. I always like to grab one of them just for a nice universal brush. You can also grab a flat brush from the acrylics. I find flats really help when doing washes and blending and trying to get things consistent and covering a large area, especially that flat brush. You can also grab larger round brushes. Any of the acrylic brushes will work for this as well, as long as they're fairly soft. And there are actual watercolor brushes which have a darker and softer bristle to them. These will get you a little less detail, but they'll be really great for getting some smooth and soft gradations. So those are our basic materials: paints, scrap paper, paper towel, and a cup of water. So once you have those, you're ready to start your process. What I'm going to do is move these out of the way and then grab my sample. So the first technique we want to do is using wet on dry. And for this, I'm going to suggest using the watercolor brush or a round brush. This is probably the most common watercolor technique you've used. Basically what you do is you're going to dip your brush into the water, and you are going to paint your paint, if you will. You are going to take your brush in and pull it towards yourself to pick up some of that watercolor on your brush. It's always easier to add more watercolor than take it away. So if you want, you can do a test strip that's pretty vibrant, so I might want to use a little bit more water with this. So there I can kind of see through. I'm going to use that. What you're going to do is just paint the square and just experiment. Notice the textures of this. If you want to make it darker with watercolor, you can come back in and add more. And notice that I'll paint back over areas to smooth it out. That's something we'll be talking about as we go through some of the washes. So just trying to get the color on there. You'll notice sometimes I'll dip into the water without getting paint just to smooth things out. I'm just adding this on. So this is using a wet paint on a dry background. Very common watercolor, probably what you've done before. Again, if you want it to be darker, slowly build it up in layers by adding more paint. So wet on dry, common technique, straight ahead, good way to paint in any line drawing or just freehand. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to rinse my brush out. I'm going to bring over my paper towel. I'm going to change colors. So you want to wash your brush every time you change colors. Kind of dragging across the paper towel to get excess water out. What I'm going to do next is I'm going to take a clean brush, that's why it's good to have multiple brushes, and I'm going to paint a puddle of water on my piece of paper here. So what you want to pay attention to is that anywhere water is, if it's wet, your paint is going to go to that area too. So if you're painting two different colors, it's good to paint one, let it dry, come back. For this one, we're going to use a nice blue. Get a little more water. If it's tacky and it's making streaks in your paint, that means that you need to go back in and add more water. So as I dip it, you'll see it starts to spread out where the water is. So what we call this is wet on wet. You'll notice that that paint disperses as we paint. It's going to the edges of where it's at. This is going to give you a much softer tone, a much more smooth value. So I like to go in and just spread it out, even it out. You may notice some texture in there from the tooth or the texture of the paper to smooth it. So wet on wet's going to give a slightly different effect than the wet on dry. A little bit softer here. Again, if you want to make it darker, add more paint. So I'm going to wash my brush. Now we're going to go with a brush we haven't used yet. This is why we moistened our paints. I tend to use a flat brush for this. Typically ones that are a little bit crustier, a little bit more solid, less flexible, will work. So dry brushing is going to be a little bit more difficult with the softer watercolor bristles. you might want to use a harder acrylic bristle. So for this, I'm basically just going to use my brush. I'm going to keep it dry, so the paint's going on dry to dry paper. So dry brush, dry paper, no dipping in water. I'm going to pick one of my colors, let's say purple. I'm going to kind of blot it, so notice I'm not painting it. What this is going to do is create some texture. This is great for doing things like grass. So when I drag it across, you'll notice it reveals the texture of the brush. It's kind of broken up. This is really good if you're painting bricks, anything like that. It's also good if you do some vertical strokes, you get some broken grass, you can layer that in. So dry brush, not adding water to your brush, not adding any more water to your paint than what you sprayed on there, and kind of using that stiffness of the brush. I'm going to set this aside, and we're going to do dry on wet. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that wet brush again, I'm going to add some water down to the paper, and then I'm going to use the dry brush on top of that. And notice what changes with this. So we know the water is going to spread it out. So dry brush, and notice that it pulls it away. So this is a way of softening your edges in comparison to that. Okay. So we've got our wet on dry, our wet on wet, our dry on dry, and our dry on wet. So we've done all the combinations of brush to paper. Now what we're going to talk about is trying to get a nice solid wash. For this, I like to use a big flat brush. Either acrylic or watercolor brush will work. I'm going to use a watercolor for this. What I like to do is start out with just a light version of a color. So for this, I am going to come in with a green. We haven't used green yet. So I'm going to paint my paint. What I'm going to do is start laying the color down. Now the goal is to make this as solid as possible. So you'll notice my water will kind of puddle in certain areas. I did all vertical brush strokes. What I'm going to do is start going in, not adding water to my brush, but trying to smooth it out. So again, to build it up, we can add more paint in future layers. So as I start to get pooling, I'm going to go over to my paper towel and dry off some of my brush and use that to my benefit and start to smooth this out. So what I'm trying to do is alternate brush strokes, vertical, horizontal, start light, can build up, and I'm trying to move that puddle to the point where my brush is kind of soaking the last little bit of it up. You notice I dried my brush, I lifted some of it out, I'm going in. So this is going to give us the most consistent color across. Anywhere you see brush strokes, you're going to want to paint the opposite way, always trying to slightly overlap your previous stroke to smooth it out. So you can get some really nice smooth effects with that. Just get a solid wash. You can try this with wet on wet or wet on dry. Either one works well. What we're going to talk about next is a gradated wash. This is basically a fancy way of saying you're doing a gradation. As I said earlier, you can start lighter and then work darker. For this one, you can also add more water back into it. Since we're opposite purple, I will use a orange. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get my basic paint, put it on there. I'm going to start dark on this one and slowly add more water. You can also start light and add more paint. I find kind of a combination of the two works well. So I'm going to paint it in there. I'm going to use horizontal stripes because I want it to get lighter as it goes to the right. I'm going to add a little more water. And typically at this point, if you're working on a project, you might want to change your water. This one's pretty purple. This is orange, which has yellow in it, so you might have some complementary colors fighting each other there. I'm going to get a little bit of water, and I'm going to start pulling it out to make it lighter. And I want to really focus on creating this transition nice and smooth. So I'm going to grab a little bit more paint, start working back and forth. Clean my brush out. I'm going to add mostly water at the end to get it almost transparent. Now, unlike the solid wash, we don't want to change our brush strokes. We're just trying to overlap our verticals here. I can probably make that a little bit darker, so I'm going to add in some more pigment and slowly work it back in. So kind of call this feathering it out or slowly blending it out. Slowly as you build, you can go in there. If you have pooling at the bottom, again, just dry your brush, pick some of the paint up and get a blend from left to right. So starting on one side, slowly adding the water and making it lighter. Next one's a variegated wash. This is where you blend between two colors. So this is where using a tool like a color wheel is going to come in handy. If we are going to start with something like a blue or a blue-violet, we will want to use colors that are similar if we want it to be harmonious. Typically, blue is going to mix into violet, making your blue-violet. That's going to be really nice. If we go with blue into orange, we may get some grays in between. It's possible, it just might not be as pleasant to look at or quite the aesthetic you're looking for. So if you're going for brown, you can mix opposite colors. Typically, you're going to want to stay with analogous or side-by-side colors. So for that, we are going to start with blue, and we're going to fade into purple. So I'm going to put blue on one side. I'm really going to concentrate it into one area. And this is going to create almost like an ombre effect. So I'm going to try to leave that wet, so using a lot of water. I'm cleaning out my brush right now because I'm going to go for the purple. One of the colors that helps mix purple is blue, so I'm not worrying about that. I'm going to put a super saturated version of purple down here, and I'm slowly going to use those two to mix together. So I'm going to bring a little purple, a little blue, and this is how you get your transition. So notice I'm doing short strokes. It's helping to control that border. I'm adding more water in. And now what I can do is go back in and add more of any color that I want. So you're using the water as a blending tool in this situation. The more you smooth your strokes out, like we did with all the other washes, the more it's going to make that consistent. Short, choppy strokes give it more of a texture. And I can start going the other way if I want. If I wanted to go to the next color off of blue, I could say, let's go green. Let's add a little green over here. I can add that in, kind of get a rainbow effect. With the purple, let's go to red. Because on the other side, the purple going away from blue is red. So we can add some of those in and feather them out. So you can get kind of a cool transition between rainbow colors. I could go on to yellow, I could go on to orange, and kind of go full circle. And what I'm going to do is try to soak up a little bit of this watercolor. Again, the more watercolor you add, the more pigment, the more intense your color is going to be. So that brings us to our last technique, and what we're going to talk about is glazing. So glazing, much like on the donut, is putting a layer over top of something else. So for this, we're going to put a base coat with a nice solid wash with red, and what I'm going to do is put some other colors over top of it. What's going to happen is those colors are going to mix optically, meaning that our eye is going to blend them together. So when I put yellow, for example, over the red, we know yellow and red mix together to make orange. So we're going to go in, we're going to just use a little bit. The key is transparency here. Paint my yellow. You'll notice it stays very yellow at that tiny point. As I go over, it's going to take on more of an orange tint. Now watercolor will be reactivated as you add color to it. So as you go out, it may be a little bit more orange than whenever it went in. What we're going to do is do this with a few different colors. So I'm going to show blue as well. Again, just getting a little bit. A lot of water goes a long way. Or a little water goes a long way. I'm going to test it here on the side to see where I'm at. I'm going to come in. Blue. Hopefully it gets more like a blue-violet whenever it goes on there. So you'll see the characteristics of the color come in. And the last one I want to show is green, our complement of red. Probably should have added more water. But it will create a darker value whenever it's over because they're mixing together. So glazing is a good way to put down a base color and then go beyond it. These are our 8 techniques for today. I want to see you practice these. You're going to be able to apply them in a future painting to create some different textures. Whenever you're done with your paints, just make sure you wipe them out. We leave them open in the back so they can dry out. We don't want to close the lid, so please don't close the lid so they can dry. And what we're going to try to avoid is anything where we leave a lot of colors if you're mixing. So if your palette looks like this, just simply take a wet paper towel. It will reactivate the watercolor, and it's easy to clean before you throw away that resource. So please leave them open, please keep them clean, and you can rinse all your brushes at your table. Thank you, and please let me know if you have any questions.